Welcome to Breaking Ground. I'm Steve Kliegerman, and I'm honored to have Jake Indursky, real estate reporter from The Real Deal, as our guest today, and Jason Thomas, Senior Vice President of Research and Analytics for Brown Harris Stevens Development Marketing. We just finished the third quarter, and we want to talk a little bit about market reports, how data is collected, how data is analyzed, and also trends in the marketplace. So Jake, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm thrilled to have you here, and it's kind of fun to interview the interviewer.
It makes me a little bit nervous, but thank you for having me on, Steve. It's great to be here.
I promise I won't be as tough as you are. So Jake, before we get started, tell us a little bit about your background. What makes you so uniquely well situated to report on data? Because, in the past, no offense to other reporters, but, you seem to look at data a lot differently than people I've spoken to in the past. And, so tell us a little bit about your background, how you got to The Real Deal, what you did before then, so people understand better how you take a look at data and the real estate market in general.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad that you think that, because I spent a lot of years working with data as my main job. So after school, I went into consulting and then tech. And when I was working at these tech companies, my role was as a strategy analyst. And so I was working in SQL, working in Excel, working in Python. So pretty hardcore stuff. It was in 2020 where everyone sort of was reevaluating their careers. I had worked on the school paper. I was the sports editor at the Tufts Daily and then the managing editor. And I just really sort of missed writing as a full-time job. So I went to Columbia Journalism School to, just sort of make a big career pivot. From there, I worked in Hawaii for a short stint, covering local politics and actually development there. Had a couple other jobs and then landed at The Real Deal a little bit over a year ago.
That's some background.
Yeah.
And some major programs that you worked on as well when you were doing data analytics. So coming into the real estate industry, a lot of us find it frustrating that the industry isn't always as transparent as some other marketplaces are. We don't have a traditional MLS here in New York City like other markets do. What kind of challenges do you find when you're doing your reports and when you're taking a look at the different markets within a market? Mm-hmm. What challenges do you face?
Yeah, we at the end of a month, end of a quarter, we get a lot of market reports. Every brokerage puts them out. You have independent analysts putting them out, and everyone does them a little bit differently. And so I think the biggest challenge is synthesizing all of that, being able to look at reports from 3 different places and sort of come up with a cohesive narrative for what happened in the third quarter, let's say. I think that, is probably the number one challenge. We get a lot of numbers and just turning it into a story.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jason, speaking of challenges, we've been working together for a number of years now. And when we started working together, one of the first things we did is we took a look at our market reports and our competitors' market reports. And then you basically told me that, not that we're wrong in the way we think about things, but we're wrong in the way we look at things. So tell us a little bit about that and how your philosophy in real estate reports here in New York City has influenced the way that we do things now, and how you've communicated with Jake recently about the changes in how we're looking at specifically new development data.
Yeah, okay. And then Jake has been great too, because he's been accepting of that change and even reporting that change, which is nice, because it is different. Other reporters could easily just say it's too different. We don't want to really to partake in that story. But Steve, in the past few podcasts, we've talked about our first real pivot, right, which was away from this quarter-over-quarter price reporting. And we can go into that a little bit more in a moment, but that was one thing. What we've done and Jake knows this story, we've spoken about it. Just to summarize, we really mathematically and statistically, we've proven that it's really more of a distraction than anything else. And so then it's like the question begs, well, what do you follow? What metrics do you really, to understand the market, what do you look at? Well, then you lead towards supply and demand. And then theoretically with supply and demand, there's a lot of years of economic history and theory. And you can say, well, this should happen based on these things. So that was really the first big shift away, right? Because if you look at a lot of and Jake, you'll know this, a lot of the reports that come in or that are produced 60 to 70 or even more percentage of that report is period over period pricing. Every neighborhood, different price points, different boroughs like that, right? So that was a big paradigm shift away from the norm. What Steve has really worked on, it really an epiphany moment for me, thanks to Steve, this last quarter, is looking at, I said supply demand is our focus, but demand is not demand, so to speak. So what I mean by that is when we see, the reason we term it demand is because there's supply on one side of the equation, there's demand, right? But in the city, we use Connecticut actually. Let's use this quick example. There's enclaves in Connecticut where there's 4 contracts signed for the 4 homes that were for sale. So supply and demand seems to be balanced, right? And demand is pretty low, only 4 contracts signed, 4 buyers. But what you don't see is that there were hundreds of buyers showing up to each of these open houses because it was such in demand and such low supply, right? But you don't see that in the market reports, right? And you don't see the potentially hundreds of people that just told their agent or representation that I don't want to get caught up in a bidding war. I don't even want to go. So in Manhattan, that becomes a bigger challenge because you would have to contact every broker for every open house and say, can you give us your open house sheet? I
was going to say, I would love if you put that data in your next market report.
Yeah, right. So Jake, so to that point, right? So we've focused much more on supply and absorption, which is what we're trying to replace demand now with absorption, right? Yeah. How do you reconcile that though when you look at other reports that are much more quarter over quarter, month over month, year over year, analysis, right? How do you justify what you report on and how you decide what you believe and what you believe your readership will think is more relevant?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing there is not sort of starting with the number. I mean, you need to have the numbers for the context, but that's why I have conversations when I do these reports. That's why I talk to Jason almost every time. And you've driven home for the last year whenever I ask about, well, why are contracts down? You say, well, you need to step back. You need to look at the demand and supply. You need to look how much, 5 buildings account for, the supply in the market. We have those conversations. And then from that, I think it's really like, our headlines very rarely say how many contracts were signed in a borough. Our headlines are, the most recent one we did with you guys were the divergence in Brooklyn and Manhattan. And so, again, I think you have those numbers, but it's really being able to have the conversations behind the numbers that can give you sort of the story of what's happening. It's not just what happened in the quarter you're reporting on, but it's what's happened in the last year, 2 years, 3 years.
So, Jake, you mentioned the divergence between Manhattan and Brooklyn. So, Jason, talk to us a little bit about that, and how did you guys kind of then work on that trend as something that actually was interesting to you that you followed up on?
Yeah, you want to start, Jake? I'll start on that. Yeah. So I think the big things were with Manhattan, we talked about, again, I don't like to talk about price period over period, but we're looking back over 10 years. And what you see, we can talk about this in another podcast, but it's really flat. If you look at what the price per square foot was closed this quarter versus the 10-year, it was truly what we call chronic x-axis, which means flat, right? And in Brooklyn, you've seen this trend up since 2019, just higher and higher and higher, almost setting a record price point every single quarter to the point where it was another record this time, right? And really, again, not trying to focus so much on price, but thinking about what price means. Price is really a function of what the sponsor has put out there, right? What the product is. And in Manhattan, we could argue or make a valid claim that over the last 10 years, the sponsor product has been relatively the same. Okay, a lot of the really high-end things that bring up the market to where it is, different areas, different neighborhoods, but overall, even keel. And in Brooklyn, we talked about the age of luxury presenting itself, where the buildings have become more and more and more like Manhattan. Higher-end finishes, higher-end amenities, larger scale. And then too recently, what I think really helped kind of peak the market is that the 2 largest projects, the largest scale, that also had the great finishes, the high-end amenities, the large-scale amenities, were also on the waterfront. That was a big difference. So just in terms of the trajectory or the trend in price per square foot. And then just quickly on the other thing was with absorption, right? We're not going to say demand anymore. Thanks to Steve, we're going to switch over now, Jake.
I don't know. I'll try my best, but
well, you'll learn. You're a quick learner. You've already shown that. So the absorption in Manhattan was down about 15% looking back over the 10 years. And again, we do it we look at the third quarter over those 10 years because it accounts for seasonality, right? It's part of the reason we do it. But so Manhattan was down about 15%. Again, that's not the whole story, right? There's a lot behind that that could lead to that. In Brooklyn, it was almost flat. It was just down a little bit this quarter versus previous quarter. So that's where Brooklyn and in Manhattan. Brooklyn just seemed to have a much better quarter, so to speak, than Manhattan did.
Got it.
And I think for me, too, when I was looking at the report and talking with you guys, I mean, and again, this is the sort of context coming in, is that North Brooklyn waterfront has been something that I have written about a lot over the last year. I mean, Williamsburg Wharf and One Domino Square, those buildings, have just been setting price records back and forth. And so to then have a market report that sort of speaks to a trend that I've been following for a year is just a really nice sort of synergy, like when the storytelling converges with the data a little bit. And then in Manhattan also, we also had that like broader story, which is this supply issue that we've talked about a lot. And I think, again, with the sort of price flatness there too, you're also just seeing that you don't have the new product on the market at the same rate that you used to. The product that is selling is these buildings that have been sitting on the market for 7 or 8 years now, and so they're not going to push pricing the same way that those North Brooklyn developments will. And then at the same time, the product that maybe would push pricing is one that's not reporting with A.D. Clarkson, and that sort of causes a whole nother set of issues.
Sure.
Great.
Better said than I could.
Absolutely.
That was fantastic. He's a data analyst.
Very well said. And we'll be right back.
What do you really need to know about buying or selling a home? First, it's serious business. And it's complicated. There's a lot of money on the table, and emotion too. You need an agent who knows the ropes. So, whether you're buying or selling your home, work with professionals who have a mastery of the craft.
I'm Brian Scott Cohen, one of the top loan originators in the country, and the #1 mortgage originator at Guaranteed Rate Infinity. Guaranteed Rate Infinity arguably has the most advanced tech in the industry. Our completely digital loan process makes it easy and efficient for homeowners, from a 15-minute pre-approval to the digital application and through closing. My team and I would love to help you get into the home of your dreams.
All right, and we're back. So, Jake, you just brought up a really great point, right? So you've been very interested in taking a look at these markets in Brooklyn, let's say like the waterfront, right, and how it's evolved over years. There are neighborhoods in Manhattan that have also evolved over years, and then there's the whole quandary of projects when they initially launch, or sometimes even later than that, not reporting data, which impacts all of these quarterly reports, semi-annual, annual reports. So how do you reconcile some of that when you're trying to do a market story, but not all the information is available to you?
Yeah. I mean, that is one of the biggest challenges. And again, I think it goes back to talking to people. And the last 5 or 6 market reports I've done, either monthly or quarterly, there's been a caveat where we've said, Manhattan new development contracts are down, volume's down, but the fastest selling building in the borough has not reported any contracts. And so then you end up spending a lot of time in the report sort of caveating what you've just reported. which is a challenge, and also, can be confusing to readers. I think, one thing that I talked to you guys about with this report was you adjusted for A.D. Clarkson for this one, which is really helpful because, then at least, even if the numbers you're making assumptions, but even if they're, within just some sort of ballpark, you can feel like the conclusions you're drawing and giving to readers are going to be accurate. Right. It's not about being within 5%. It's about just being in the right direction.
Right. And we also, and you mentioned this before too, we also adjusted for 125 Greenwich Street because there was some contracts that were inclusive that made the numbers look better than they were. And we found out pulling deeds exactly which ones those were and moved that back too. Because I understand it was for us too. You try to build a story or understand what the data is trying to tell you, and then you have to keep caveating or asterisks and say, but. It really erodes the meaning of or the punch of what you tried to look at in the first place. So we tried that really for the first time. It's happened before on the over-reporting side. That's a little easier. But this time our broader team, made a lot of calls regarding A.D. Clarkson to see what our best guesstimate was to help. And then that helps a lot too because, as you mentioned, this is not just a building. This is one of the priciest buildings out there. And so not just from a contract sign side, but from a volume side, a dollar volume side, it shifted things dramatically just to make that best guesstimate, our best representation of what we thought it was.
Right.
So hopefully that, like you said, that was helpful. I think.
Right. Yeah. It's not some, tiny building selling at normal price per square foot. So it's something that will actually shift the reporting when you factor it in. So it is really helpful to at least have somebody do that for you. And then you can just talk about the quarter, in a way where it probably will look pretty close to actuality once those numbers do come in.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So you've been with The Real Deal how long now?
A little bit over a year.
About a year, right? So how is your reporting and research on these different reports, whether they be our reports or our competitors' reports, how has that changed over the last 12 months as you're seeing the different philosophies of the different companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest help for me is the context that I've gained in the last year, being able to understand not just the numbers that I'm getting from these different brokerages and independent analysts, but knowing sort of what's, just having read and talked to people for over a year now about what has happened in the last 5 or 6 years. Like one of the things that I'm now the most interested in is the Manhattan supply issue, which has been a progressing issue for the last year. I think having reported on it for a year and having, read about what has happened in the last 10 years in the city, makes that a topic that I think is going to be, that I can say with authority is going to be relevant, for understanding development in the borough going forward. And we've talked about that also. So yeah, I think it's just gaining that sort of really strong basis of knowledge helps me contextualize all the numbers I'm getting.
Yeah. And so just to piggyback for a moment, this is great timing too, Steve, because we've said, Jake, and we talked about this, if peer-to-peer pricing was really a distraction, we focused more on supply and demand, and now we're saying, and a lot of it's with Steve's lead, to say that, again, demand doesn't tell you the whole story, right? It's really hard to actually understand it. So what can you really put your finger on? And this is where your stories come in and where our reports are shifting even more in the direction of. It was inclusive of price, now it's exclusive of the majority of price. Now supply and demand, but now really looking at, or supply and absorption, now really focusing on demand. On supply, because that's where you can really take your finger and say that's where the supply is now. Mm-hmm. So this is the one metric we can really follow with some degree of certainty. And we have to think market proof for that in new development.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because before market proof, and we've talked about this, you could see what was active on the market. But a lot of times the shadow what the developers is withholding is an even bigger percentage, or usually is a bigger percentage of the market. So that's really where our reporting is going to go. And it sounds like your stories is the supply. Because long-term, with economic theory, supply is what really controls the market. And that's what we all seem to be mutually focused on going forward, which is the real story. And that will determine even demand, pricing. It really all comes down to supply. And thankfully, again, let's plug market proof, we can put our finger on that. and say, here's where it is, here's where it used to be, here's where it's going. And especially with pipelines, Steve, right? Because there's this life cycle of a building. They have to file for permits. They have to apply with the Attorney General for their offering plan. We can also see a crystal ball almost, right, into future supply. And so we have a very good understanding of where supply is. And then we, again, use that theoretical economics to say, this is why demand might be low or high. This is why pricing may seem like it's moving one way or another. We all seem to be converging on the right metric, which is supply.
Right. Yeah. I showed up and had market proof ready to go. So I didn't know what it used to be like, but it's been helpful.
Good.
You dodged a bullet with that one. It was tough because you would literally have to be, pouring through Schedule A's, offering plan information, and trying to reconcile what was sold with what was shadow, but there was no central database. No one was entering that. So we were all entering all that stuff ourselves. Yeah. And I'm sure, actually, could be interesting to take a look at the evolution of market reports over the last 10 years.
I mean, that's something that I get so many of them, and I'm really curious about how everyone sort of does their numbers and, who looks at which one and how, the market report sort of sub-industry is really an interesting one to me.
Yeah, so that could be fun to do because I know, obviously, you'll give us a call or we'll give you a call about a story idea, but how in between market reports, how do you come up with your story ideas? What do you wake up at 6 a.m. and say, oh my God, I have to look into this?
Yeah, I mean it's a lot of different sort of avenues. I mean the market reports are great sort of in isolation, but also I think following them and following those sort of numbers can really sort of uncover some broader trend stories. Like I think a big story this year was sort of the movement of money downtown in Manhattan. And that was something that if you were just sort of following the contracts that were being signed, like following the reports from you guys, from Market Proof, you would start to see these bigger sales happening along the West Side Highway. And, that's something that is just really like reading a lot. It's, reading the individual sales, reading the market reports, and then like building that, oh, there's actually something happening here. Another one is lawsuits, which is the thing I write about that people probably don't want me to write about in the industry. But those are always really helpful. I mean, that really can tell you a lot about what's happening in the industry too.
Sure. Interesting. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, frankly, the lawsuit that came out of the Flatiron building really, that changed the entire plan for the Flatiron building. Like the original plan was different than what they ended up with now, which is a fully residential, basically, building. Yeah. I can't say a whole lot because I did sign an NDA years ago, but the original plan wasn't to have the whole building be residential. So lawsuits definitely do change the landscape of our industry without a doubt. And I'm sure it's really interesting to look at. I'm sure also a lot of issues get settled because no one wants a lawsuit to be filed, because then everything becomes public, right?
I'm sure. Yeah, it's shocking to me when they're not settled, and then you have all the emails and the text messages out there, and it's a goldmine for a reporter. But it's that's where a lot of the juicy stuff comes. But I mean, the other thing is just really like talking to you guys, talking to all the agents working in the city, and you'll just be having a conversation, and it's not no one ever. Rarely, I wish they did it more, do they say, here's what you should write about? But you'll be talking and they mention this thing they're working on and this weird thing that happened, and then your ears sort of perk up and you try and go back and, see if that's happening more. And I mean, that's really where a lot of the best stories are that people aren't already thinking about that they should be.
Yeah, it must be a lot of pressure though, always having to come up with a story idea to make sure that you're keeping your byline, your headlines up.
Yeah, you can, it is hard. It's New York City real estate, so there's not really a shortage of things to write about in that sense. But yeah, I mean, I think we do a really good job of sort of covering the news, like the sort of daily headlines, then also balancing that with doing some of these like longer term features, investigations. So yeah, I don't know. Every morning I wake up and, I do need to think, what am I going to write about today? Usually I know. The days I don't, I give you guys a call.
That's great.
I love that. That's great. what do you see in the future? Like what haven't you covered yet that you're trying to figure out either how to cover or find the information to cover that you think that would be interesting to people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I cover, we're a small publication and we cover a lot. So I talk to you guys a lot about the, Manhattan, Brooklyn new development market. There's a lot of shifts happening in the broader residential real estate industry. And I think, just sort of like staying on top of that beat and how brokerages are sort of navigating consolidation in the industry. And again, I think the new development market here is also going to be something that's really interesting to follow. Like, the conversations that I've been having is that the supply issue that we've talked about is not going to be resolved next year or in 2 years. And what that means for developers, for agents, for buyers and sellers, I think is going to be a really interesting thing to follow.
I completely agree. As a matter of fact, Jason, we did in our reports, we've been taking a look, 3 to 5 years out in inventory. And what are you seeing in that?
Exactly what Jake just said, and what you've echoed is that we don't see the trend. I think your words were probably a decade it takes to even start to maybe change course, and we don't know because we're not that far out. But is that over the next at least say 5 years, we don't see any improvement in terms of a nice amount of supply, an uptick in supply. It's been low. Just a quick status. It is interesting. We're always looking back. We're talking about 10-year data. From 16 to 22, 2016 to 22, there was a surplus of new units coming out from sponsors. It was always keeping up with that 10-year absorption line or more. So we're producing a surplus. And then since then, so 23, 24, 25, and then as you said, going forward several years, it's maybe 40 or so % under that absorption line. So you're producing, or new sponsor units are far less, 40% less or so than what the absorption is. So you're building this deficit now, and we don't see that reversing. Mm-hmm. And that's where the story is, right? Because when you start to have a deficit in that supply, not that there are not enough units out there to satisfy a year's worth of absorption, it's not that. But when you start to just keep pulling away and eroding at that supply number, things, again, economic theory starts to take over and say something has to happen.
Right.
And there's where the story is. The real story is it's happening. What are the ramifications of that on the demand side, on the price side?
Right.
So if we're watching that supply metric, how do all the other metrics change because of that?
So it sounds to me like we need to work more on data that's more micro data on the submarkets, right? And where the demand is where the supply is within those submarkets, and then where prices are going, because it could be that we're going into an inflationary period in pricing in certain submarkets in certain neighborhoods because the supply is so low.
That's so well said. And just to jump in, I know you're sorry, I didn't mean to jump over you, but that's right. If supply is the story, all these market reports are 40, 50, 60, 80 pages depending on the firm, right? 90% of that you can cut away, and supply is what's important. So we can build these back out to 40 pages, but it needs to be supply broken out into these submarkets. Yeah. Because that, again, looking at Manhattan from 30,000 feet up of Brooklyn, it doesn't tell the whole story, because supply is not the same. It's equally distributed across a borough, right, or even a neighborhood. So that is our next step with our report. Our report is constantly changing, as you know, and you've been willing to go along with those changes with us and report on. We appreciate it. But what we say, Steve, you've heard me say this before in reporting, is that stasis is extinction and evolution is existence. So you have to be constantly changing that report and trying to find the better version of it, which we have done every single time. And it probably drives everyone a little crazy, but we're going to continue that path. But the path forward is supply. Yeah. And to break down supply into the submarkets.
So, Jake, would you ever consider doing a story about, the possible projections of what the market looks like a year or two from now because of supply? Other factors obviously come into play, but, and then, or look back a year and say, hey, this is what we saw, this is what happened, how do we reconcile it?
I don't know if I can have you pitch me on a story on the podcast. My answer is always, I need to talk to my editor.
And it doesn't have to be our story. It could be looking back at data from other firms, Rebney data even, just curious, like, would I wonder if the real deal, I wonder if Stuart would ever do a prediction story.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be our story,
No, I mean, that is something that, we're I think we are interested in, and and I did a story where I think I talked to you guys for part of it, which was looking at this issue, and it was at a high level. It was basically, I think it was the first story we did that's like, Manhattan is facing a supply issue, and obviously you can get a lot more detailed within there, the Upper West Side we know has almost no supply coming on. Downtown, same thing. Upper East Side, a little bit more. Those things, I think, and I think the thing for us, even stepping further back is like, when we know, that the Upper West Side doesn't have a lot of supply, how do we turn that into a story that's going to capture people's attention? And so sometimes that's figuring out, well, who's building there? Are they an interesting person to write about? And so it's not just doing the numbers, but even then figuring out the people behind the numbers, the characters that are, bucking the trend of, we don't have anything being built on the Upper West Side coming onto market. This is the person who is doing that. As an example. So that's sort of the other side of the equation, which is, I talk to you guys about the numbers a lot, and then it's also figuring out how do you, again, getting back to the narrative idea, how do you find the characters, the people, the imagery, it's the writing side of it, really. So I think all of those stories that we might do about what's going to happen in the next few years will also sort of depend on who are the people that are sort of working within the next few years and how are they handling it.
Right. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And these are the people that are kind of, they're changing the landscape of New York City, right? So they're important people. Why are they doing it? Why are they choosing to do it now? You're seeing an opportunity in the Upper West Side, per se, right? They might read your article and say, hey, I better jump into this because, I didn't even realize this. And if I didn't read Jake's article, I wouldn't even know it, because maybe they were focused in Brooklyn, or maybe they were focused in Jersey, or they were focused downtown. And they lost their focus on the Upper West Side because for years the Upper West Side was the story, right? Now the Upper East Side is the development story, and downtown is the development story, and the Upper West Side is lingering a little bit in supply, which says to me there's an opportunity.
Yeah.
Well, Jake, this has been really great. I look forward to having you back again. Maybe 6 months from now we can take a look back at some of these market reports and see if those trends have changed or not. It's always a pleasure working with you and the team at The Real Deal. And Jason, thanks for all your insights as usual. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks so much,
Jake.